Rain threaded its silver fingers against the tall windows of Harrington Estate, blurring the world beyond into a watercolor of grief. Within the dim corridor, lit only by wavering gaslight, Eliza Whitmore stood with a silver tray balanced carefully in her trembling hands. The porcelain teacups chimed faintly against their saucers, betraying the tremor she fought to master. She had once carried such trays with confidence through these halls as a maid. Now she carried them as Lady Eliza Harrington, and the difference felt more perilous than proud. 9 weeks. The physician's words still echoed inside her like a fragile bell. 9 weeks of secret wonder growing beneath her heart. She pressed her palms subtly against her abdomen, as though to shield the life there from the chill that seemed to seep through stone and silk alike. The child was hope, yet also accusation. To the world beyond this corridor, she was not a bride but an intrusion, a girl who had risen too swiftly and too suspiciously. Laughter spilled from behind the study door, deep male voices threaded with polished amusement. She recognized her husband's tone at once, measured, aristocratic, composed. Lord Edward Harrington never raised his voice. He shaped it, honed it, wielded it like a gentleman's blade. It was that restraint that had first captivated her, even when she had been invisible in a plain servant's apron. It was that restraint that now kept her guessing at every glance he bestowed upon her. She meant only to knock. Instead, she heard him say, clear and unhurried, "It was a mistake entirely." The words drifted through the wood with terrible precision. There was no anger in them, no hesitation, only certainty. A murmur of agreement followed, low and approving. Someone chuckled. The air thinned around her. The tray slipped. Porcelain shattered across polished marble, a violent chorus against the muffled warmth inside the study. The laughter ceased. Silence expanded like a bruise. Eliza stared at the wreckage at her feet, at the spreading stain of tea that crept toward the hem of her pale gown, and understood that whatever dignity she had painstakingly assembled these past weeks had fractured just as cleanly. The door opened. Edward stood framed by candlelight, tall and immaculately composed despite the sudden interruption. His dark hair, brushed precisely back, caught the amber glow. His gray eyes, unreadable as a winter sea, settled first on the shards, then on her. Behind him lingered 2 gentlemen of Parliament, curiosity flickering openly across their faces. "Eliza," he said evenly, as though her name were both question and command. "I beg your pardon," she replied, dipping into a controlled curtsy despite the shards biting faintly through her slippers. "The fault is mine." Fault. The word tasted bitter. One of the gentlemen cleared his throat and withdrew, murmuring something about engagements elsewhere. The other followed, leaving husband and wife suspended in the corridor's echoing quiet. Edward stepped forward, his boots crunching lightly over porcelain. He did not reach for her at once. He simply regarded her as though measuring the cost of something invisible. "You should not carry trays in your condition," he said at last. The statement might have sounded protective to a kinder ear. To hers it sounded like censure. "In your condition." As though she were fragile china herself, useful until cracked. "I have carried them all my life," she answered softly. "You are no longer required to." Required. The word lodged between them like a closed door. A draft wandered down the corridor, stirring the edges of her gown and lifting the faint scent of rain. She searched his face for softness, for contradiction of what she had heard, but his expression remained a gentleman's mask. She longed to ask what had been a mistake, her presence, their marriage, the child, but pride held her tongue. Pride was the only inheritance she possessed. Footsteps descended the grand staircase. Lady Margaret Harrington emerged, her posture immaculate, pearls gleaming against austere black silk. Her gaze swept the scene and sharpened with delicate displeasure. "How unfortunate," she observed. "Clumsiness has a way of revealing itself at the most inconvenient moments." Eliza inclined her head. "Yes, my lady." Lady Margaret's eyes drifted, calculating, to Eliza's midsection, then back to her face. "One must hope that certain missteps do not prove as irreversible." The implication hovered, venom wrapped in velvet. Edward's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That will be all, mother," he said quietly. Lady Margaret offered a thin smile and retreated, her skirts whispering judgment along the marble. The corridor felt smaller after her departure, as though the walls themselves had absorbed her disdain. Edward bent at last and gathered a larger shard of porcelain, placing it upon the tray she still clutched. His fingers brushed hers, brief, accidental, electric. For an instant, something warmer flickered in his gaze, something dangerously close to regret. "You must not distress yourself," he said. "Over broken china?" she asked, unable to stop the tremor beneath her composure. Over words spoken among men. Her breath caught. So he knew she had heard. And were they spoken in earnest? She asked before courage deserted her. He straightened slowly. Conversations within that room are not for corridor speculation. The rebuke was mild. It cut all the same. A distant clock chimed the hour, solemn and resonant. Rain pressed harder against the windows as though urging confession from stone. Eliza felt the fragile architecture of her hope shift within her. If he had married her from obligation, if the child she cherished was to him merely consequence, then love was a luxury she had foolishly imagined. I shall retire, she said carefully. The hour grows late. He studied her for a long moment, as if searching for something he dared not name. Very well. She turned, gathering what dignity remained, and walked the length of the corridor alone. Each step echoed with the memory of those 5 words. It was a mistake entirely. By the time she reached her chamber, her composure had thinned to transparency. Upon her dressing table lay a folded handkerchief she did not recognize, fine linen, delicately embroidered with the initials each. Her fingers hovered above it, uncertain whether the letters stood for Edward Harrington, or for a history she had never truly been invited to share. Morning arrived with a pale, reluctant light that revealed little mercy. Eliza had not slept. The embroidered handkerchief lay upon her dressing table like evidence awaiting judgment, its careful initials stitched in a hand too elegant to be accidental. She had turned it over in her fingers until dawn, searching for a hidden message in its weave, yet finding only the echo of those 5 words that would not loosen their hold upon her heart. By breakfast, the estate stirred with a peculiar brightness. A carriage had arrived before sunrise, bearing fresh roses the color of blush and cream. They were arranged lavishly in the great hall, their fragrance climbing the staircase in sweet defiance of the rain-washed gloom. A small card rested among them, sealed with the Harrington crest. Lady Margaret stood inspecting the arrangement when Eliza descended. How thoughtful, the older woman remarked coolly. My son has always understood the importance of appearances. Eliza's pulse quickened. She approached the flowers and broke the seal with careful fingers. The card contained only a single line, written in Edward's precise script, for the lady of the house. Nothing more. The simplicity felt deliberate. It was not an apology nor an explanation, yet it was unmistakably public. The servants observed from a discreet distance. Whispers fluttered like sparrows. Lady Margaret's gaze lingered on Eliza's face, measuring her reaction as though it were an investment's yield. You see, Lady Margaret said softly, my son is a dutiful man. The word dutiful struck harder than any insult. Eliza inclined her head and thanked her mother-in-law with composure she did not feel. If the roses were a shield, they were one made of petals, beautiful, fragile, insufficient. By evening, Harrington Estate glittered with chandeliers and polished silver. A gathering had been arranged hastily, as though the house itself sought to correct some invisible imbalance. Members of neighboring estates arrived wrapped in satin and skepticism. Conversation shimmered beneath the vaulted ceilings, each compliment edged with inquiry. Edward stood near the hearth in formal black, his posture unassailable. When Eliza entered in a gown of soft ivory silk, chosen carefully to flatter without provoke, his eyes found her at once. For a moment the room narrowed to the distance between them. Then, without flourish, he crossed the floor and offered his arm. A hush rippled outward. Eliza, he said, his voice low but carrying, you honor us. She accepted his arm, aware of every gaze tracing the curve of her silhouette, searching for signs of scandal beneath silk. His hand rested lightly over hers, steady and warm. It was the first time since their marriage that he had sought her publicly. A lady's fan snapped open nearby. How devoted, someone murmured. Edward guided Eliza through the room with measured grace. A Harrington does not abandon his wife, he said quietly, just for her. The statement might have been reassurance. It might have been reminder. She searched his profile for tenderness and found instead resolve. He was not a man easily read. He was a man easily obeyed. They paused before the assembled guests. Edward lifted a glass. My wife has endured unkind speculation with admirable restraint, he declared. I trust this house will show her the respect it shows me. Silence followed, thick and cautious. Then polite applause, scattered but audible. It was a gesture, bold, protective, strategic. Eliza felt the ground shift subtly beneath her feet. Whether he defended her from affection or from obligation no longer mattered to the watching world. The declaration had been made. Yet as the evening unfolded, scrutiny sharpened rather than softened. Lady Beatrice Ashford, resplendent in crimson silk and a smile too bright to be sincere, approached with predatory elegance. "Lady Harrington," she said, dipping into a shallow curtsy. "How swiftly life transforms. Some might call it miraculous." Eliza met her gaze steadily. "Life is seldom concerned with our timing, Lady Beatrice." A flicker of irritation crossed the woman's face. "Indeed. Though one does admire efficiency." The implication hovered, poisonous and sweet. Edward stepped forward before Eliza could reply. "You mistake cruelty for wit, Lady Beatrice," he said calmly. "It does not suit you." A murmur of surprise traveled through the circle. Lady Beatrice's smile faltered. "I meant no offense." "Then you have succeeded," Edward returned. He offered Eliza his arm once more and led her away, leaving the lady to recover her poise alone. The act was unmistakable. Protection had shifted from private courtesy to public alignment. Music began, a waltz slow and deliberate. Edward turned to her. "May I?" Her breath caught. Dancing while carrying his child felt at once intimate and precarious. Yet she placed her hand in his. The orchestra swelled, the room revolved. As they moved, she felt the steadiness of his frame, the careful precision with which he guided her. He did not speak for several measures. When he finally did, his voice was scarcely more than a murmur beneath the strings. "You doubt me." It was not accusation, it was observation. "I heard you," she answered simply. His hand tightened almost imperceptibly at her waist. "And yet you remain." "I am your wife," she said. "For better or worse." The words settled between them, weighted with meaning neither fully voiced. Around them the dance continued, silk brushing silk, whispers weaving through candlelight. When the final note faded, Edward did not release her at once. "Appearances," he said quietly, "can be arranged. Truth requires patience." Before she could ask what truth demanded such endurance, a servant approached discreetly and bowed. "My lord, the jeweler has delivered the piece you requested." Edward's expression flickered with something unreadable. He excused himself briefly, leaving Eliza surrounded by watchful eyes and unanswered questions. Moments later he returned carrying a velvet box. He opened it before the assembly. Inside lay a delicate gold locket, its surface engraved with a single blooming rose. "For my wife," he said, fastening it gently around her neck. "May she never question her place in this house." Applause rose more confidently now, approval swelling like a tide. The gesture was undeniable, glittering, irrevocable. Eliza felt the cool weight of the locket settle against her heart, directly above the fragile life within her. Yet as Edward's fingers brushed the clasp, she noticed something, a faint inscription etched along the inner rim, visible only for a fleeting instant before the lid closed. Always. The same initials as the handkerchief. The same careful script. And suddenly, beneath the applause and the roses and the orchestrated loyalty, a more dangerous question began to bloom. For whom had always first been intended? The applause dissolved into polite conversation, yet its echo lingered in Eliza's ears long after the guests dispersed into smaller constellations of speculation. The gold locket rested against her collarbone, deceptively warm from Edward's touch. Its weight was slight, yet it pressed upon her with the gravity of inheritance, promise, and doubt intertwined. She excused herself before curiosity could sharpen into interrogation, retreating through corridors that smelled faintly of beeswax and fading roses. In the privacy of her chamber, she closed the door and turned the key. The fire had burned low, casting a copper glow across the walls. She removed the locket carefully and opened it with trembling fingers. Inside, opposite the engraved rose, lay a miniature portrait no larger than her thumb. It was not her likeness that stared back. The painted woman possessed dark curls and eyes bold with practiced confidence. The artistry was delicate, intimate. On the inner rim of the gold casing, the inscription gleamed clearly now, always. Her breath faltered. The initials no longer felt ambiguous, they felt divided. Edward Harrington. But also someone else's claim upon him. A knock sounded at the door, measured, unmistakable. "Eliza," Edward's voice called softly. She closed the locket and composed herself before unlocking the door. He entered without ceremony, dismissing the servant who had followed at a discreet distance. The candlelight caught the stern line of his mouth, the faint strain beneath his composure. For a moment neither spoke. "You left abruptly," he observed. "I required air," she replied, though the chamber felt thick as velvet. His gaze shifted to the locket in her hand. "You have examined it." "Yes." silence stretched, taut as drawn wire. "Who is she?" Eliza asked, her voice steady despite the tremor coiling beneath it. Edward's jaw tightened. He crossed to the hearth, bracing one hand upon the mantel as though gathering strength from stone. "A portrait commissioned 2 years ago," he said at last. "Before our marriage. You intended it for her." "I intended it," he corrected carefully, "as a promise." The distinction did not soothe. "And is it still?" He turned then, meeting her gaze directly. The restraint that so often armored him seemed thinner tonight. "No." The word fell heavy and unembellished. "Yet you gave it to me," she pressed, stepping closer despite the warning pulse in her temples. With her likeness inside. "I gave it to you because it belongs to my wife." The answer was precise, insufficient. "Am I merely its newest occupant?" she asked. Pain flickered across his features, swift and unguarded. "You are not a placeholder, Eliza." "Then why does it feel as though I inhabit a life rehearsed for another?" Her voice cracked on the final syllable, betraying more than she intended. She pressed her hand instinctively to her abdomen, steadying herself. The gesture did not escape him. Edward moved toward her then, but halted an arm's length away, as though proximity required permission. "The portrait was commissioned under pressure," he said. "My mother favored the match. Alliances were discussed. Expectations were assumed." "And your heart?" she asked. "My heart," he replied after a measured pause, "was not consulted." The confession trembled between them, fragile as glass. She searched his expression for deception and found only fatigue and something perilously close to regret. "Then why keep it?" she whispered. "Because I believed I was expected to." The honesty startled them both. Rain began again beyond the windows, tapping insistently against the panes. Edward reached for the locket, and this time she allowed him to take it. He opened it, studied the miniature for a long moment, then removed it with deliberate care. The small portrait slipped into his palm, no longer shielded by gold. "I will not have you haunted by what was never truly mine," he said quietly. He crossed to the fire and held the painted likeness above the flame. The edges darkened, curled, and vanished into ash. Eliza watched the transformation with a strange mixture of relief and grief, for promises made in youth, for illusions burned too late. When he returned, the locket lay empty except for the engraved rose and the word always. "Always," she repeated softly. "For you," he said. The words were simple, yet they carried weight that trembled with risk. She wanted to believe him, she feared to. "You spoke of truth requiring patience," she said. "What truth?" Edward hesitated, and in that hesitation she felt the old distance threaten to reassert itself. "The words you overheard," he began slowly. "They were spoken of circumstances, not of you." "It was a mistake entirely," she quoted, each syllable etched into memory. "Yes. Explain." He drew a breath as though preparing to dive beneath cold water. "My mother pressed for a public acknowledgement that our marriage was imprudent. She believes it necessary to preserve certain political ambitions. I refused to denounce you directly. I said only that the manner of events, the scandal, the haste, was a mistake." "And you believe that distinction absolves you?" she asked. "I believed it would protect you." "From what?" "From becoming a target more vicious than rumor." She studied him, weighing intention against injury. "You sought to shield me by confirming their doubts. I sought to prevent their knives from sharpening." The metaphor hung between them, raw and unvarnished. She felt anger rise, yet beneath it flickered understanding. Edward had been raised within walls where affection was secondary to strategy. He wielded silence as others wielded swords. "I do not require protection that erases me," she said softly. The words struck deeper than accusation. He stepped closer, closing the space at last. "Then tell me how to stand beside you," he murmured. Her breath trembled. "With honesty. Even when it costs you." His hand hovered, uncertain, before settling lightly over hers. The contact was cautious yet unmistakably deliberate. "Very well," he said. "Then hear this without embellishment. I married you because I could not bear to see you ruined by whispers I helped ignite. I remain your husband because I choose you." Choose. The word shimmered with possibility. "And the child?" she asked, voice scarcely audible. His gaze dropped to her hand against her abdomen, and something softened irreversibly within him. "The child is not a mistake," he said, each syllable deliberate. "It is consequence, yes, but also blessing." Tears threatened, but she held them back. The room seemed smaller, warmer, altered by the courage of his admission. For the first time since that corridor shattered with porcelain, She felt the axis of their marriage tilt toward something resembling partnership. Yet as silence settled, not hostile but contemplative, a shadow moved beyond the frosted glass of the door. A faint shift of fabric. The unmistakable pause of someone listening. Edward followed her gaze. And from the corridor came the soft, unmistakable click of a retreating heel. The echo of the retreating heel lingered like a threat that refused to name itself. Edward moved to the door in 2 swift strides and opened it, but the corridor stood empty save for the long spill of lamplight and the distant murmur of guests below. He did not need confirmation. His mother's presence had always been more atmosphere than apparition, felt before seen. Eliza's pulse thudded in her ears. The confession they had just shared, raw, imperfect, fragile, now lay exposed to interpretation beyond their control. Within Harrington Estate, truth was seldom allowed to remain unexamined. She heard, Eliza said quietly. Edward did not deny it. Very likely. And she will not be silent. No, he agreed, a note of steel entering his voice. The air between them shifted from intimacy to strategy. For the first time, they stood not opposite one another but aligned against a common force. Eliza felt the subtle strengthening of her spine. Fear remained, but it no longer stood alone. Below, the music had resumed, lighter now, oblivious to the quiet war brewing above polished floors. Edward extended his hand. Come, he said. If a battle is to be waged, it shall not be in whispers. They descended together. Conversation faltered as they re-entered the drawing room. Lady Margaret stood near the hearth, surrounded by attentive matrons whose expressions balanced sympathy and anticipation. She turned as her son approached, her composure immaculate. Edward, she said smoothly, I trust you have reassured your wife. I have, he replied. And reassured yourself? She asked pointedly. Eliza felt the room lean closer. Edward did not release her hand. There is nothing about my marriage that requires reassurance. A delicate silence followed. Lady Margaret's gaze flickered to their joined hands. You misunderstand me. I speak only of prudence. The estate cannot afford prolonged scandal. The estate, Edward returned evenly, cannot afford cowardice. The word struck like flint. A ripple of unease traveled through the guests. Lady Beatrice Ashford, ever attuned to discord, drifted nearer with predatory grace. Surely, she interjected lightly, this is a matter best discussed privately. On the contrary, Edward said, his voice rising just enough to command the room. It has been discussed privately for too long. Eliza felt her breath hitch. This was no longer damage control, this was declaration. My wife, he continued, has borne insinuation with more dignity than any among us. I will not permit that dignity to be bartered for political convenience. Lady Margaret's smile thinned. You speak as though this household were an adversary. I speak as its heir. The distinction carried weight. Several gentlemen shifted uncomfortably. Power within Harrington Estate had always flowed from father to son, yet Lady Margaret had long directed its currents. Edward's tone suggested a redirection. And what of the circumstances? Lady Margaret pressed. The haste? The talk? Edward's grip on Eliza's hand tightened, not possessive but resolute. The circumstances were mine, he said. The haste was mine. If blame is required, assign it properly. Eliza's heart stuttered. He was offering himself to the fire. Lady Beatrice tilted her head. How noble, she murmured. Though nobility rarely alters fact. Edward's gaze fixed upon her. Fact is this. Lady Eliza Harrington is my chosen wife, and she carries my child. Any who question her honor question mine. The words rang through the chamber like a struck bell. A collective intake of breath followed. There it was, no longer implication, no longer rumor, but open acknowledgement. The secret she had guarded beneath silk now stood illuminated before crystal chandeliers. Lady Margaret's composure wavered for the first time. You would announce such matters without consultation? I would not have my wife endure another whisper. The room held its breath. Eliza felt heat rush to her cheeks, yet beneath it rose something steadier, gratitude tempered by awe. He had chosen exposure over evasion. A murmur began at the edges of the gathering, surprise, calculation, reluctant admiration. The announcement shifted the narrative irrevocably. What had been speculation became legitimacy. What had been scandal became lineage. Lady Margaret drew herself upright. You risk much, Edward. I risk less than she has, he answered. The simplicity of the statement cut deeper than any rhetoric. For a long moment, mother and son regarded one another across the polished expanse of the room. Years of expectation, ambition, and unspoken control passed between them without need of articulation. At last, Lady Margaret inclined her head, barely perceptible yet unmistakable. "Very well," she said. "If this is your stance, it shall be observed." It was not surrender. It was recognition. Edward turned then, addressing the assembly. "Let it be known that Harrington Estate stands united. My wife's position is not provisional. It is permanent." Applause followed, tentative at first, then gathering strength as self-interest aligned with certainty. Society favored clarity. Edward had provided it. The orchestra, sensing resolution, struck a brighter chord. Conversation resumed, altered in tone. Curiosity gave way to congratulation. Skepticism softened into calculated warmth. Lady Beatrice withdrew with a tight smile, her influence diminished by the public shift. Eliza exhaled slowly. The room no longer felt like a tribunal. It felt, astonishingly, like acknowledgement. Edward leaned closer, his voice low enough for her alone. "Forgive the spectacle." She met his gaze, finding in it neither calculation nor performance, but earnest resolve. "You have altered more than spectacle," she replied. "Have I?" "You have altered us." Something unspoken passed between them, an understanding forged not in secrecy but in shared defiance. Yet even as relief unfurled within her, a sharp pain seized low in her abdomen, sudden and unanticipated. Her fingers tightened involuntarily around his. "Eliza?" he asked, alarm threading his composure. The pain subsided as quickly as it had struck, leaving only a lingering tremor. She forced a breath, steadying herself beneath the chandelier's glow. "I am well," she said, though uncertainty flickered behind the assurance. Edward studied her closely, his earlier boldness giving way to protective instinct. Around them, celebration continued, unaware of the fragile line upon which joy and peril balanced. "Perhaps we should retire," he suggested. She nodded, allowing him to guide her from the room once more. As they crossed the threshold, applause swelled again behind them. Approval, acceptance, perhaps even admiration. But as the doors closed and the music softened to a distant hum, another sensation stirred beneath her ribs, deeper, more insistent than before. And for the first time since his public declaration, Eliza wondered whether the greatest trial of their marriage had yet to begin. By the time they reached the upper corridor, the music below had blurred into a distant pulse, indistinct and irrelevant. Edward's hand remained firm at Eliza's waist, no longer ceremonial but urgent. The earlier pain had not vanished. It had retreated like a warning delivered softly rather than withdrawn. "Tell me truthfully," he said, his voice stripped of public command. "Is it the child?" "I do not know," she answered, unwilling to cloak uncertainty in comfort. He did not waste breath on reassurances he could not guarantee. Instead, he guided her into her chamber and summoned the housekeeper with clipped efficiency. Within moments, instructions rippled through the servants' quarters. A carriage was dispatched for the physician. Fires were stoked higher. Water was heated. The grand estate, so recently host to glittering approval, reshaped itself around a single, fragile purpose. Eliza sat upon the edge of the bed, her fingers pressed lightly against her abdomen. The locket rested cool against her skin, its emptiness symbolic and clean. Edward knelt before her without hesitation, abandoning hauteur for proximity. "Look at me," he said gently. She did. Beneath the dim firelight, his composure had altered. The aristocratic distance that once guarded him had dissolved, revealing something far more human, fear sharpened by devotion. "If there is danger," he continued, "I will bear it with you." "You cannot bear this in my stead," she replied, though her voice trembled. "No," he conceded. "But I can refuse to leave." The admission struck deeper than any vow spoken before witnesses. He had stood beside her publicly, now he chose to remain privately, where no applause softened consequence. Another wave of discomfort coursed through her, stronger than the first. She inhaled sharply. Edward rose at once, guiding her carefully back against the pillows. When the housekeeper entered, flanked by a midwife summoned from the village, Edward did not retreat to the corridor as custom dictated. "My lord," the housekeeper began delicately, "it may be best." "I remain," he said. There was no argument in his tone, only decision. The women exchanged glances but complied. Curtains were drawn. The chamber glowed with contained warmth. Outside, the rain resumed, tapping insistently against glass as though echoing the rhythm of Eliza's strained breath. Hours seemed to compress and elongate without pattern. The physician arrived, grave yet reassuring, his presence steadying the servants who hovered at thresholds. He examined Eliza with careful restraint, murmuring that early distress need not mean calamity, though rest was imperative. The child, he believed, remained secure, for now. For now. Edward stood near the hearth during the examination, his knuckles white against the carved mantel. Each murmur from the physician drew his gaze sharply. Each flinch from Eliza tightened something unspoken within him. He had confronted Parliament with less visible strain. When the physician concluded, he addressed them both. "Stress is a subtle adversary, my lady. You must avoid it." A faint, almost humorless smile touched Eliza's lips. Avoid it? Within Harrington Estate, stress was as constant as the ticking of its clocks. After instructions were given and the chamber quieted, Edward dismissed all but the housekeeper. Even she lingered only briefly before yielding to the intimacy of the hour. At last husband and wife were alone, save for the restless weather beyond the panes. Eliza's breathing had steadied, though fatigue weighed heavily upon her. Edward sat beside the bed, closer now than he had ever permitted himself without invitation. He reached for her hand and found it willingly offered. "I believed strength meant control," he said quietly, as though confessing to the darkness itself. "I believed silence could shield what mattered." "And now?" she asked. "Now I see that silence isolates what it seeks to protect." The vulnerability in his admission dissolved the final residue of formality between them. She studied his face, this man who had been shaped by expectation, trained in restraint, armored in reputation. Beneath it all lay a heart less practiced in courage than in duty, yet no less capable. "You spoke for me tonight," she said softly. "Not as heir, but as husband. I should have done so sooner." "Yes," she agreed gently. "You should have." The rebuke carried no venom, only truth. He accepted it without defense. A hush settled, tender rather than tense. Edward's thumb brushed lightly across her knuckles, a small, unconscious gesture that revealed more than proclamations ever had. The fire crackled. Rain softened. "I will not permit my mother to dictate the shape of our lives," he said after a moment. "Nor will I allow society to define your worth." "You cannot silence them all," she replied. "I need not silence them," he returned. "I need only stand with you." The simplicity of the vow steadied her more effectively than the physician's assurances. She shifted slightly, wincing at residual discomfort, and he leaned forward at once. "Does it return?" he asked. "Only faintly," she said. "Like an echo." He exhaled, tension easing by degrees. Carefully, reverently, he placed his hand over hers upon her abdomen. The gesture was tentative, as though he sought permission from both mother and child. "I have been a cautious man," he murmured. "Caution has cost me honesty. It will not cost me this." Emotion welled within her, not the sharp despair of overheard words, but a deeper swell of recognition. The man before her was not flawless. He was evolving. The conflict that had begun in corridors and drawing rooms had narrowed now to something elemental, whether fear would continue to govern them or whether choice would. A faint sound interrupted the quiet, a firm knock upon the door. Edward's expression hardened reflexively. "Enter," he called. Lady Margaret stepped inside, her posture unyielding yet her eyes searching. She had shed the theatrical composure of the evening. Concern edged her voice. "I was informed there was distress," she said. "There was," Edward replied evenly. "It is passing." Lady Margaret approached the bedside, her gaze settling upon Eliza with an intensity no longer laced with overt disdain. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, with deliberate care, she removed a ring from her gloved hand, a simple band of gold, worn thin with years. "This belonged to Edward's grandmother," she said. "She, too, entered this house under scrutiny. The admission was unexpected." She extended the ring toward Eliza. "The Harrington line has endured stronger storms than gossip." Eliza accepted it, surprised by the tremor she glimpsed in the older woman's fingers. In that exchange lay not affection, perhaps, but acknowledgement, a subtle shift from opposition to reluctant alliance. Lady Margaret inclined her head and withdrew without further ceremony. When the door closed, Edward looked at Eliza with quiet astonishment. "You have altered even her," he said. "Perhaps," she replied, studying the ring in her palm. "She merely required time." He smiled faintly. "As did I." Outside, the rain ceased at last. Clouds thinned, allowing a pale shaft of moonlight to pierce the chamber. It illuminated the locket resting against her skin, the ring glinting in her hand, and the man seated steadfastly beside her. The pain did not return. Instead, a profound stillness settled, fragile yet luminous. Edward leaned forward, pressing his forehead gently to hers, an intimacy stripped of ceremony. "Behind no door," he said softly, "shall I ever diminish you again." The vow was not grandly proclaimed, it was breathed, private and irrevocable. And as dawn's first light began to dilute the darkness beyond the windows, Eliza understood that the 5 words which had once shattered her had been replaced by others far stronger, words not overheard in corridors, but spoken openly at her side.